Welcome, everybody, to this National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges webinar on effective interventions for child exposure to domestic violence, 20 years after the publication of the Green Book. It's been a pleasure working with the NCJSCJ staff and with Dr. Jeff Edelson, who's joining me on this webinar, on the special Juvenile and Family Court Journal issue that celebrates the 20th anniversary of the Green Book work. This webinar is going to highlight themes from the recent journal issue and from the Green Book work that was started more than 20 years ago. Specifically, what we're going to cover in the webinar is we're going to give you some history of the Green Book and the Green Book work. We're going to share 8 key themes from the special journal issue that was published in December of last year, and we're going to feature some of the article content on those 8 themes. And before I get started, I want to tell you just a little bit more about me, and then Jeff will say a little bit more about him. I was a consultant on the special journal issue, and I was also a supporter of the Green Book work early on in my role as program officer at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. And then in the intervening years, I've continued to work with the National Council and with other Green Book partners to improve responses to the co-occurrence in families of domestic violence and child welfare. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff to introduce himself and to tell you about the Green Book work.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. And it's been a really pleasure to work with Lucy on this journal issue and the webinar. And Lucy and I go back a long way because Lucy supported a lot of the initial work on children exposed to domestic violence around the country when she was at the Packard Foundation. I am a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. For 29 years, I was at University of Minnesota and headed and founded the Minnesota Center Against Violence and Abuse, MNCAVA. And I've focused my research on children exposed to domestic violence primarily, as well as intervention with men who batter. So without further ado, I think we will go on and just dig into the webinar. We have only an hour. We're going to try to take 45 minutes to talk, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer. If you have questions as we go through, put them on the chat box, and one of us will try to address it. Some of them. We won't have time to address everybody's questions. But the Green Book was published in 1999, and it's called the Green Book. It's really effective intervention in domestic violence and child maltreatment cases. But the National Council had done a lot of work prior to that, publishing a model code on domestic violence, which had a blue cover. This one had a green cover, so this one's called the Green Book for short. And they also published really a showcase of effective programs responding to children exposed to violence around the country prior to publishing this set of recommendations. As I said, it was published in 1999, the Green Book, and by the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges, I believe with support from the Hilton Foundation. There were a group of 3 key stakeholder groups that were brought together over 18 months: child protection, juvenile and family courts, and domestic violence advocates. There were many other key stakeholders that could have been involved, like law enforcement and the like, but let me see. Can you all hear me? If somebody...
Jeff, I
okay,
can hear
good.
you. Yeah.
Okay. Because I see some people can't hear, but those are individuals. Yeah, sorry.
We're getting a lot of
yeses.
That box.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being supportive. It was supported by federal agencies, private funders, and key set of recommendations and principles that came out of it were you know, we really realized working together, it was actually a lot of tension when we were working together. Domestic violence advocates did not trust child protection workers and vice versa. Some of the court judges were distrustful of both of the other systems, so it took a long time for us to really develop trust. And we came to four guiding principles: that safety, stability, and well-being. The language of child protection really applies to all family members. We wanted victim survivors to find safety, stability, and well-being, as well as children in the family. And we wanted perpetrators to also be intervened with and become safe individuals in their families or in their communities if they didn't stay together. Another key principle was children remaining with non-abusive parent. And that was pretty important for a national judges organization to say children should remain with, we're primarily talking about mothers, the non-abusive parent. And really the theme of that was, if we're trying to ensure safety of children, one of the best ways to ensure that safety is through the safety of the mom as well. We also took the guiding principles that there are many points of entry to services, that there should be many avenues to get help, and the differential response, that different families require different types of responses. Not everybody should be in child protection, not everybody needs that level of intervention, and so we really took differential response as a key principle. It was co-chaired by a judge, Judge Leonard Edwards, who's leading a webinar tomorrow from Santa Clara County. He's now retired. And Carol Williams Spigner, who at that point was at the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families in the federal government, is now at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, the principal authors were myself and the late Susan Schechter. So the federal government pulled a set of funding together to fund 6 demonstration sites, and these are the 6 demonstration sites across the country. In addition to those sites, there were many other sites that didn't get funded by the federal government but found other funding and developed their own Green Book efforts. In addition to that, there was a nationally funded technical assistance project, as well as a cross-site evaluation of all 6 sites and the impact of the Green Book recommendation, the implementation of the Green Book recommendations in those 6 sites. So I'm going to turn it back to Lucy at this point, unless there are any questions.
I'm not seeing any at this point.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Lucy.
Okay. Okay, great. So that brings us to December of last year, when 20 years of Green Book was published, and that is a special issue of the Juvenile and Family Court Journal. And it includes 6 articles by subject experts and an introduction by Jeff and me. The articles focus on research, policy, and practice developments that came about as a result of the Green Book. Some of the articles describe the site-based work in the sites that Jeff was just describing, and it highlights them from different stakeholder perspectives: the judge's perspective, researcher perspective, practitioners, domestic violence advocates. And they discuss what was accomplished in the Green Book and describes some of the improvements that continue today. A couple of other highlights are identifying the gaps in the Green Book work. It couldn't do everything, and there were quite a few things that it wasn't able to do, and then offering suggestions of how to address some of those gaps. So specifically, there was an article by Dr. Megan Holmes and her colleagues at Case Western Reserve University that summarized the relevant research that happened leading up to the Green Book and then following the Green Book. Then there was a article authored by Futures Without Violence Policy Director Kirsten Stewart that painted a picture of the advocacy landscape before, during, and leading up to the Green Book, and then since the Green Book. Then there was also an article featuring the site work in Santa Clara County, and that was authored by Judge Edwards and Judge Catherine Lucero, both of whom were very involved in the Green Book work in that site. Then the next article features an on-the-ground knowledge by domestic violence advocates that participated in site work and their reckoning of the Green Book process and outcomes. Then there's an article by Judge Karen Howes and Associate Justice Ann McKeague looking at the omissions and also the opportunities in the Green Book, and in particular focus on the overrepresentation of families of color in the child welfare system. And then there's also an article by David Mandel and his colleague Claire Wright providing a model for engaging fathers who have been violent and who are involved with the child welfare system. So that gives you a sense of the content of the special issue. And what we identified 8 key themes that were present across the articles, and we are going to focus on those 8 themes in the rest of our comments. So just quickly to go over you can see them there on the slide, but the one is the value of collaboration. Another is the ground gained through the Green Book work, and then what has been lost since then. The need for Green Book work to address diversity, inclusion, and the overrepresentation of families of color in the child welfare system. How Green Book project leadership and power dynamics affected the work. The role that judges play in systems change work. How research, policy, and practice inform and influence each other. Policy advances and gaps since the Green Book, and the need to engage fathers. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with highlighting some of the content from the articles as they relate to these 8 key themes. And I'm going to start with the value of collaboration and shared perspectives. You can see a couple of quotes taken from the articles. We've got quotes for each of the 8 themes on the slides. So the Green Book emphasized collaboration among 3 systems, child welfare, domestic violence, and the juvenile court. And Jeff mentioned that there was a lot of mistrust across these systems. They had different mandates, they had different philosophies, they had different approaches. And so given that context, you can see why the Green Book emphasized collaboration across systems to better serve the families. So even though collaboration was a key goal of the work, the sites quickly found that it was more of a strategy than an outcome. It was a way to get to the outcomes that they wanted. And there's a quote in the article by Judges Edwards and Lucero from Judge Mike Clark that I think sums up some of the significance of the work that happened as part of the collaborations. And that is, child welfare professionals and DV advocates were able to come together with an attitude toward collaboration for the first time in local history. So as a result of those collaborations, some significant practice and policy changes occurred. And the way that they got to a greater understanding was through doing myth-busting exercises, cross-system dialogues, cross-training, to debunk myths, increase understanding, and build strong relationships. And in a couple of the sites, they included law enforcement as part of their partnership. So I'm just going to, yes, jump in, Jeff.
Can I just, I just wanted to jump in and reinforce some of the issues that we confronted in developing the Green Book. I think in a lot of these sites, many of the battered women's programs are much smaller than the county child welfare systems or state child welfare systems and court systems. And it's very hard for many of the battered women's advocates to be at the table for every meeting. So collaboration, while it's a great goal, sometimes for smaller organizations, it's very hard to be at the table for so many parts of that collaboration. And in addition, the funding and, as you mentioned, legal mandates are very different between the court system and child welfare, in particular compared to battered women's organizations, which are often funded by grants, local charities and the like, but not necessarily by public monies, whereas child welfare and the courts are publicly funded with public mandates. And so sometimes that tension was really hard to overcome in making collaborations successful. That's all I wanted to add.
That's great, thank you. And I think there were some very difficult conversations that had to happen because of those differences, and differences in resources, differences in clout, and differences in approaches.
And in our meetings over those 18 months, we had people crying in these public meetings. There was a lot of tension, but we actually, by the end of the 18 months, we really became a group that was very cohesive and really consistent in our views. So it was nice to see that happen, and I think that was replicated at many of the Green Book sites that were funded.
Definitely. Even though the conversations were really hard and they didn't always get to answers, they did strengthen the relationships, and they increased an understanding of the limitations of each system and also what each system had to offer. And that resulted in some increases in the understanding of the co-occurrence in families of domestic violence and child maltreatment. That was new information for a lot of people. A decrease in the number of children removed from their homes because of domestic violence. There were probation and law enforcement protocols developed. So the collaboration was an effective strategy that resulted in some very concrete improvements to systems responses. Let's see. And just a couple of other things. Even though they did a lot of work on their differences, they all recognized that they shared a common goal of wanting safety and well-being for the families. So that brought them together. So I am going to keep moving along. We're going to go to the next theme, which is ground gained and ground lost. And, you know, I just mentioned some of the accomplishments that happened in the sites, but there really were a lot of significant changes to how direct services were provided and changes to agency policies. And the working arrangements among justice system players changed, was more collaborative, and that resulted in better outcomes for the families. There were more voluntary services for families rather than having them have to even go to dependency court and the child welfare system. Some of the sites increased their services at the court for domestic violence victims. They better coordinated services for offenders. They co-located expertise, so they would have a domestic violence advocate in the child welfare system, or in some cases had a whole unit that was dedicated to handling domestic violence cases. And there were many other accomplishments that happened in the sites and as a result of the Green Book publication. So I encourage you to read the articles, and you'll learn about more of them. But there were also some of those accomplishments that weren't able to be sustained beyond the Green Book. In one site that had a specialized domestic violence unit in child welfare, that unit no longer exists. So there are no longer in-house experts on domestic violence. They still do domestic violence training with all of the workers in child welfare. So there's a general knowledge, but there isn't that in-depth understanding of the complexity of the issues that these families are facing. So,
Lucy?
Yes,
Lucy?
please jump in. Yes.
So I think this was one of Susan Schechter's and my biggest fears in doing this work is that we would create change that might not be sustained. And so, for example, in a child welfare system, perhaps many more battered mothers were being screened for domestic violence, but maybe the change in addressing their safety wasn't happening. And so gained ground, but that the ground that was gained was maybe more assessment and less of a change of the traditional intervention. And so this was a constant fear of ours in doing this work, that we raised the issue. More families are identified as having both child maltreatment and domestic violence, but perhaps the service system wasn't changing. So our goal was really to create systemic change from protocols to supervisors to line workers, so that those would become part of day-to-day practice. Some places that happened, some places it didn't happen.
Right, and then in some cases, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So with many of those changes were able to be sustained, and then some over time, with the funding going away, and some of those relationships that have been built through collaboration changing as new leaders came in. Some of them have gotten lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
I do want to clarify, as we're talking about the themes and the content right now in this webinar, we are focused on the special journal issue that came out last year. It is not a Green Book 2.0. It was not a Green Book. It was articles that really reflected back on the work of the Green Book. So our comments today, we're weaving in the original Green Book work from 20 years ago and the site work that happened after the publication of the Green Book with the content of the special journal issue that was published in December of last year. So I just wanted to clarify that. We would love for there to be a Green Book 2.0. Go ahead, Jeff.
And Lucy, Stacy Seacrest and Joan Meyer both asked similar questions about why were some changes sustained and others not. And I do think it had to do both with funding. When 2008, the last recession hit us, a number of programs were cut back. It also has to do with the large turnover in staff, primarily both in domestic violence and child welfare agencies, because training basically happened, but it has to happen continually because there's so much turnover. And then finally, because judges rotate through courts, so we train a group of judges, but then they rotate out of the juvenile family court that was involved in these cases, and new judges were sitting hearing the cases, and they didn't necessarily have the training. So I think it really does need sustained training given the amount of turnover that happens in all three of these systems. Go ahead, Lucy.
Yes, I would agree, and I would add to judges the attorneys, both attorneys who work within the child welfare agency, but also other attorneys that are involved in the dependency system, because a lot of the petitions that were happening, there was really an effort during the Green Book years to not have a lot of failure to protect petitions and to make sure that legal responses were not further victimizing the adult victims. And I think there's been some slippage in that area, largely because those attorneys don't have the information that attorneys had during the Green Book years. So I'm going to move next. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I just often called failure to protect a lazy coding of a case, in that if you assign failure to protect to a mother, it's often because the perpetrator is perpetrating violence. You don't necessarily have an intervention that has leverage with that perpetrator. So you code the mother or find her for failure to protect or endangerment, when in fact it's the perpetrator who's introducing that danger to the family. And so we worked a lot during the Green Book demonstration sites to try to move away from using failure to protect or endangerment when it was really trying to be used as a leverage to move the mom and the child to safety from a perpetrator's violence, and really to focus on holding those perpetrators accountable for the violence and toxicity that they were introducing to the family. So go ahead, Lucy, sorry.
No, that's great. And just on this particular theme, to end on a more positive note, there are still leaders involved in doing this work who have that longevity and understand the complexities. And the work has shifted over time as new research about trauma and the effects of trauma have come in, and the effects of ACEs on individuals have come in. So, you know, in one site, the Domestic Violence Council is now a Family Violence Council, and they still track domestic violence data and outcomes and are still working with the key system partners to improve practices to make sure that the outcomes for the families are good. So I wanted to just point that out. And I'm going to move now to some of the gaps in the Green Book work and some of the comments that the special journal authors made about some of the gaps in the work. There was a lot to do to address the mistrust across systems and to get those systems working better together. But there were also things that were left out as a result. There was mention in the Green Book of cultural competency, and there were efforts to address diversity and inclusion in the sites, but there wasn't a lot of guidance in the Green Book about how to accomplish cultural competency, what that would actually look like on the ground. And sites did work on that. They knew that they needed to bring the community perspective in, that they needed to bring the views of people with lived experience into the work, and that they needed to bring in other agencies as well. I did mention that some of the sites brought in law enforcement as a key partner, but all of the sites brought in other agencies to some extent: substance abuse services, mental health services, housing programs. They also brought in faith-based organizations and culturally specific organizations so that they could get information about how to best serve the families in those communities. But this wasn't easy. They experienced challenges in having people with lived experience in the room with system professionals and trying to create safe spaces that would welcome all these different perspectives. So I would say, even though there were attempts to do that, that they weren't entirely successful, and that what a lot of the sites ended up doing was having separate focus groups and venues for people with lived experience and bringing in community perspectives in different ways and having that inform the Green Book work happening in other venues and meetings.
And Judges Howes and McCaig will be doing a webinar devoted to this, correct?
Yes, based on the articles that they wrote, so Judge Howes and Associate Justice McKeague. And so they really focus in their article on the overrepresentation of people of color in the child welfare system. And that's an issue that we know that the Green Book work was not able to directly address. They recommend some strategies for picking up on the principles of the Green Book and carrying the work forward, but addressing the overrepresentation as part of that work. So some of their recommendations are fully implementing existing policies that we have, like the Indian Child Welfare Act, bringing in other agencies like healthcare, mental health systems, schools, and law enforcement into a more collaborative process, using innovative approaches like differential response that Jeff mentioned, and cultural humility, using local data, engaging judges to bring in family members' voices into the judicial process. Those are just some of the recommendations that they make in their article about how we can pick up on what the Green Book was able to accomplish and take it to the next step to look at the overrepresentation of families of color in the system and address that problem.
And their webinar will be on April 13th.
Great. Okay. Great. I'm going to move now to a dynamic that we mentioned, that Jeff mentioned, which is project leadership and the differences between clout and resources and power among the participants in the Green Book, and how that affected the work, both the process and the outcomes. So there were initial challenges in even getting domestic violence advocates to participate in the work. These systems had been in adversarial positions in relation to each other often, with domestic violence advocates fighting to make sure that adult victims' rights were respected. And, they did come to the table because they knew that building those relationships would help their clients and improve practices. And the sites varied a lot with regard to which system was kind of the lead. In El Paso County, Colorado, TESA, the local domestic violence agency, was the lead in the Green Book work. And that shifted the whole nature of the work because they were at the center. They were the leads in shaping the dialogue and the work. And it meant that women were central to the work, and the knowledge and on-the-ground understanding of domestic violence was central to the work. In other sites, they handled the power dynamic differently. Santa Clara tried to address the power imbalance by having a community-based organization host the meetings and lead the meetings. So it wasn't a judge leading the meetings. It wasn't a child welfare director leading the meetings. It was a neutral community-based organization. And they didn't meet in a system site. They didn't meet in the courthouse. They met in a neutral location as well. And that helped create greater safety and a more neutral ground for conversation and collaboration. In San Francisco, there were 3 lead agencies, child welfare, domestic violence, and the courts. And the domestic violence leader was treated with respect and as an equal in a lot of the work, but really felt that because the domestic violence agency that she led didn't have the power and clout, that she wasn't able to be an equal player ultimately with the other 2 leaders in that work. But ending on a positive note, that domestic violence agency was the Asian Women's Shelter, and because of their focus on culture, language access, immigration issues, they were able to bring those issues to the table in a unique way that I think didn't happen in some of the other sites. So I am going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to talk about some of the other key themes in the special journal.
Yeah. So we still have 4 more points to cover, and we do want to allow time for question and answers. And so I'm going to move through a few of these a little more quickly. The role of judges in systems change is another key point that came up. And tomorrow's webinar is led by both Judges Edwards and Lucero, who are from Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, San Jose area of San Francisco Bay Area. They'll be leading the webinar tomorrow talking about their experience in Santa Clara County. I just want to say how important Judge Edwards' leadership was in this whole effort. A lot of judges that I've interacted with over the years say, well, I can't get involved because I have to be impartial. And judges have to stay impartial, so they can't get involved in advocacy or coordinating councils and the like. And Judge Edwards was really convincing to say that judges don't have to be neutral about violence. They can be against violence and for preventing violence. And that doesn't make them impartial. And I really respected that view and his and the other judges that were involved in developing the Green Book and who I've interacted with over the years. And another piece that Judge Edwards talked about was the whole idea of reasonable efforts. So in reunifying a family or in removing a child from a family, often the child welfare system is charged with making reasonable efforts to reunite the family before removing that child. And Judge Edwards said, well, reasonable efforts should not only include services for the child and keeping the child safe, but they should include services for safety of the non-abusing parent, the victim survivor. And he would hold the child welfare systems accountable for providing reasonable efforts of services to the battered mothers in the cases where their children were before the court. And I thought that was a really interesting extension of the idea of reasonable efforts to include not just safety of the child, but safety of other victim survivors in the family. Santa Clara was a really unusual site of the 6 sites. It had a very active domestic violence council long before the Green Book came along. And in fact, many of the ideas in the Green Book were generated from Santa Clara and some of the other systems that were represented in the Green Book Advisory Committee. I really think that what they did is that they had like 3 levels of intervention that was going on. They had key policymakers at sort of the macro level, the policy level of the community, who were interacting around changes in policies that would affect all the different systems involved in their domestic violence council. They then had agency directors and supervisors involved in how do we change practice in these systems, how do we train people and make system level changes, and then at a 3rd level, the actual frontline workers, child protection workers, advocates, guardians ad litem and the like, interacting together around specific cases to collaborate. And so while what we heard when we started on the Green Book was that there were a lot of micro interactions, one child protection worker, one advocate who had a great relationship and could work together. What we tried to do is push those up into the system so that there were system rules and then push it even higher so that there were actual protocols and even changes in legislation that would allow people to work together and collaborate more fully. So I think Santa Clara and the webinar tomorrow should be really enlightening in how well organized they were, how collaborative they were, how many different systems were involved, and how they did it at multiple levels of the systems involved. Lucy, do you want to add anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in to highlight El Paso County, Colorado. They were not able to keep their juvenile court leadership involved in the Green Book, but they were able to bring a criminal court judge in, and that judge was able to provide some key leadership and make some practice changes, including bringing in a coordinator of services for people who were violent and helping to improve compliance with orders and also reduce recidivism. So just another example of a court leader really changing practice.
And actually each demonstration site was very different. It really depended on who was the fiscal agent for the Green Book grant. And I think they really had different characteristics depending on whether it was based in the courts, based in a child welfare agency, or based in a domestic violence advocacy program. And they really did take on different characteristics, and a lot of times the battered women's advocates talked about, depending on who had control of the funding, really affected how these Green Book demonstration sites developed. Okay, I think I'll move on to the next one. We still have only about 20 minutes left. So the relationship between research and policies and practices, and Megan Holmes and her colleagues did a really thorough job, if you can get a hold of their article, looking at the research on children exposed to domestic violence and the co-occurrence of child maltreatment and domestic violence even before the Green Book. Evan Stark and Ann Flitcraft published one of the first articles in the late 80s looking at this co-occurrence of domestic violence and child maltreatment, and then reviewing the research in the 20 years since the Green Book and looking at future needs. I do think over the decades that I've worked on this, there's been a growing recognition of the impact of domestic violence, adult-to-adult domestic violence on children in the home. Sometimes I think that becomes to the point where people believe that every child exposed to domestic violence is harmed by that exposure. And what we have found out through the research is that each child has a different set of risk and protective factors present. Some children are very resilient because they have very protective battered moms. They have protective siblings. They have protective relatives, best friends, parents, and teachers, and others. And that those protective factors buffer the kinds of impact that domestic violence can have on them as they are exposed to that in their home. And I think one of the lessons from the Green Book and these decades of working on this issue is that these diverse impacts require diverse responses. And that's where way back 20 years ago, the Green Book talked about differential response, that not every child necessarily needs to be within a child protection system. And in some ways, some child protective systems will disempower the moms. And so we have to be careful about what is the child protective system's role, how do they intervene to provide safety to both the child and the battered mother, the victim survivor, and are there other community-based responses that might be more appropriate and more helpful for both moms and kids who have been exposed to domestic violence. So the review of the research that Megan Holmes and her colleagues at Case Western did focus on training, impact of training, how we assess children exposed to domestic violence and the impact on them. And I can say from my years of working on this issue that the impact differs greatly on children, and that we need to be really careful to assess those risk and protective factors, the protection that battered moms can offer, the risk that the father may represent, the risk that weapons in the home may represent, the risk of mental health among caregivers, the risk of substance abuse. So there are a lot of different issues in the assessment of child exposure and its impact. Certainly, many studies have shown that children I wouldn't say just, but children exposed to adult domestic violence, it can have the same impact as children who are directly maltreated themselves, directly physically abused or sexually abused. It can have as significant impact on those children. For other children where there are many more protective factors available, it may have much less of an impact on them. So we have to be very careful about doing differential assessment and then thinking about interventions. Very few children end up being removed by the child protection system, even though that is the threat that many systems hold over parents. We need to think about safety planning, parenting after the violence, and what's the role of a perpetrator in that family, or co-parenting, or even in having no contact with the child. Again, that differential response and how impactful is that differential response, and then thinking about batter intervention programs and how they impact not only the safety of the victim survivor adult, but also of the children in the home. And can those men still engage as parents of this child, or should they be kept from the child? And that's a very hard decision that many judges are unwilling to make, to keep a father away from a child. But in some cases, that's absolutely necessary. And in others, the father may become safe, become supportive. We have to be very careful about how they interact, though, with the adult victim survivor as a co-parent with that child. and whether we want parallel parenting and not co-parenting. So there are a lot of issues that come up around policies and practices and what we know about the impact of those policies and practices on families. And I'd strongly recommend the article by Holmes and her colleagues in reviewing that. Lucy, I don't know if you...
yeah, I'll jump in. You know, it's interesting to look at the journal issue that was published last year. You mentioned the research on risk and protective factors, and we know that some of that research is being incorporated into the development of model programs through the Quality Improvement Center on Domestic Violence and Child Welfare that is currently being funded by federal agencies. So it's another way to show that link between research and practice. And then just on a very kind of micro level, in the Edwards-Lucero article, they talk about the importance of their research partners to their work, that very early on their research partners were at the table helping them develop a theory of change. And it was the theory of change that they developed that then helped them figure out which practice and policy changes they wanted to work on. So just wanted to highlight a couple more examples in the articles.
Yeah. And one of the pieces I think that's become even more prominent in recent years is the whole set of studies around adverse child experiences. One of those adverse child experiences being exposure to domestic violence, and the realization that many children who are exposed to domestic violence are also exposed to other adverse experiences in their family, being direct victims of child abuse, exposed to mental health and substance abuse issues in the household, and the variety of 10 adverse child experiences. If you don't know about the ACEs study, there are many articles written about it. There's a great TED Talk by our Surgeon General, California Surgeon General, about ACEs and its adverse child experiences and their long-term impact on both children and as people age. I'm going to move on to gaps in federal policy. Kirsten Stewart, as Lucy mentioned at the beginning, from Futures Without Violence, developed a great overview of federal policy, both advances and the lack of advances in certain areas over the years. And started really by talking about what a patchwork we've had of policies, both at the federal and state and local level, around domestic violence, child protection, and then the co-occurrence of both child protection and domestic violence in one family. It wasn't until 1974 that we had the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, which focused on child protection, and it wasn't for another 10 years that we had the FIPSA, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, that focused more on services to battered women and their families. And then the Violence Against Women Act 10 years later, and all the reauthorizations. The good thing about the VAWA and CAPTA and FIPSA is that they've all been renewed, and a lot of the Green Book recommendations have been incorporated into them, and support for services for children and youth, for engaging fathers. In 2005, the addition of children and youth services was incorporated really as part of incorporating some of the wording of the Green Book. And then in 2010, the CAPTA and FIPSA being merged, and collaboration, technical assistance, and research focused on the overlap of child abuse and neglect and domestic violence were incorporated, language incorporated into those different laws. Unfortunately, in 2018, the Families First Act had in its draft language recognizing the importance of domestic violence, but in the final draft was not incorporated. So as Kirsten points out, there's still a lot to do in terms of both federal, state, and local policies, federal, state, and local funding, And the idea of incorporating many of the ideas we've been talking about today into these policies and funding streams that support collaboration and cross-training and cross-work that we talked about throughout this webinar. Susan Schechter, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, oh, sorry, Jeff. Yeah, no, I just wanted to jump in on that point. One of the things that Kirsten mentioned, and to pick up on Jeff's point, is that because the funding streams to these different systems is siloed, it does make it very difficult to advocate for federal policies that support collaboration across systems. And really, we need new funding streams that think more flexibly, but we also need collaboration, advocacy across systems to be able to kind of counter some of that siloed funding.
Okay. Do we have any questions?
No, not
well,
on
question
the,
about, yeah, just a question about COVID-19. You know, I'm
right.
just so concerned about children and adult survivors being closed in homes with perpetrators at this point of time, because many children and many survivors talk about their first help seeking goes to family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, clergy, all the people that we've been closed off from in this current period of time. And that's just very concerning. And then even the New York Times today ran a story on monitoring text, email, website usage, and how batters do that kind of monitoring all the time. But when you're closed in, it makes it even harder to use those kinds of technology to reach out to other people. So just very concerned about this period of time, hoping that it ends soon, although I think we're going to be in different waves of closing down much over the coming 18 months. So I want to move to the, oops.
There's one more question. No, yeah. You're fine. It actually pertains more to the research theme that you talked about, but there was a question about the effects of domestic violence on older children, the oldest child in the family, and I don't know if we want to get to that level of specificity, but do you, did you want to address that?
Yeah. If you go to, so I've put over 100 of my papers online. Oops, I misspelled my last name. How about that on the chat box? If you go to my website, you can link into academia.edu, where I put about 100 of my articles online. They're all free. You don't have to pay. And I have done a number of reviews on the impact of domestic violence on children of different ages. So one of the studies that looked at police going on domestic violence calls, they found a disproportionate number of young children to be present when they arrived. And in fact, older children have the option of getting out of the house, escaping, staying after school, doing extracurricular activities, staying at friends, hanging out in the neighborhood. So in fact, what we found is it's likely that younger children are more often exposed to violence in their home than older children, because older children can get away more often than younger children. But those impacts of exposure, regardless of age, have been found to go on long-term into your adulthood. So there are a number of long-term studies that have looked over 25, 30 years at cohorts of children who are now adults, who are even parents themselves, and the impact on their peer relationships, their intimate relationships, have been negatively affected by that early exposure. In fact, one of the key factors that you find in many studies of problems of teens and young adults and even adults is early exposure to violence at home, both direct child abuse as well as domestic violence in the home. So I'm gonna go, so the website is my personal one, jedelson.com, which I put on the chat box. So last point I want to talk about, and then we want to open it for more question and answer, is the need to engage fathers. there was a lot of discussion during the Green Book development about accountability for batterers, and there were even some papers written at that time about how systems can hold batterers more accountable. Some states have allowed child protection systems to intervene with non-custodial men in the homes who are abusive. The only concern that some people have about those laws is whether that then gives that non-custodial male parental rights over a child. So there's a fine line to walk here. You want to engage the father or the male in the household who's being abusive and exposing the children to violence, but you also don't necessarily want to provide him with more leverage or rights over a child or his or her mother. So there's still a lot to do. There was not much on engaging men and boys in the Green Book or even fathers. That's been much more of an emphasis in recent years, and since it was incorporated into the Violence Against Women Act, there's been much more activity. David Mandel will give the last webinar on April 28th with his colleague Claire Wright, and they wrote the paper in the journal issue in December. And David and his colleagues have developed the Safe and Together model. They're based in Connecticut. They focus on working within the child protection system to engage fathers and men who have been committed domestic violence. Susan Schechter, the late Susan Schechter, talked about, and it really had an impact on me early in my career, is that there's a gender bias in many courts and child welfare systems that say that, well, first of all, that mothers are the responsible person for providing safety for their children. So that safety plans end up focusing on the mothers providing safety rather than holding the fathers accountable. That's what she was talking about in terms of gender bias in the child welfare system. And so really working hard to hold men accountable, to intervene with men, to have separate safety plans, not one family safety plan, but separate safety plans where there's one for the abusive male to work on his violence and end his violence, and a separate one for the mother and the mother and children together. Again, we talked about failure to protect earlier. I think using failure to protect and endangerment to engage mothers is really avoiding engaging the person who's being violent towards the children and the mothers, and that we need to figure out leverage over the men who are being violent. So there was a project in San Diego County that at one point in Southern California that paired probation officers with child protection workers because they realized they had a very large overlapping caseload. And the child protection worker and the probation officer would go together to visit the man, and with the leverage of the probation officer, the child protection worker would work with the man to on a safety plan, to getting help, to enrolling in a battery intervention program, and staying in the program and completing it. Many men enroll, they think that's enough to do, and then drop out. And so keeping people men in those programs is very important. And again, what we often see in many of these systems is cases listed under the mother's name, and the fathers are actually absent from many system responses. So it's really important that we look at the coercive control that the men are introducing into the household, and that's where David Mandel's, he calls it perpetrator pattern-based approach. And I think that's very much linked to the idea of coercive control. Again, Evan Stark, who I mentioned earlier, has written a wonderful book on titled Coercive Control, and thinking about domestic violence more broadly beyond just a single violent incident or threatening incident, to look at a pattern of coercive control and look at perpetrators' pattern-based controlling behavior and trying to intervene in that pattern. So I'd highly recommend you attending David Mandel's webinar on April 28th as well. Oh, and I see it's already noon. So we have engaged some question and answers. We might have time for one or two questions. I see,
Jeff, we
ahead.
also have, there's a lot of comment, and we've also,
okay.
we've heard from the National Council folks that we will get a transcript of the chat box, and we'll be able to follow up with some of the questions and comments that people have been making throughout the conversation. So I think given the time, that's probably the best thing to do at this point, but you can see on this final slide, you have our email addresses, and Jeff has sent you other information. National Council folks have sent you links to the other talks that are happening this month, and you've got a link to access the journal that was published last year. So I think, is there anything else, Jeff, that you can think of? Or?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming and sticking with us, and we will try to answer additional questions. Sorry we didn't have more time for question and answers.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, and the National Council. Bye, all.
Okay. Amber, I don't know if you're going to say a formal goodbye or...
I guess not.
Okay.
Bye, all.